The forest of death loomed before Naruto, its jagged branches clawing at the sky like the skeletal remains of some ancient beast. The wind howled through the trees, carrying whispers that made the hairs on his neck stand. His stomach growled, a painful reminder that he hadn't eaten all day. He pressed a hand to his aching belly and forced himself forward. He wasn't supposed to be here. The forest of death was off limits, even to Genin, but desperation had a way of driving people to madness. For Naruto, the hunger gnawed at him just as much as the emptiness in his heart. He trudged through the dense underbrush, eyes scanning the ground for anything edible. Roots, berries, anything. As he stumbled deeper into the forest, he noticed a faint glow emanating from behind a thicket. Curiosity outweighed caution, and he pushed through the dense vegetation, thorns scraping against his arms and legs. What he saw made him freeze. Nestled in the center of an ancient, crumbling ruin was a pedestal. Upon it rested a crystal container, pulsing faintly with light. Naruto's breath caught as he approached, his eyes locked onto the object inside, a glowing fruit unlike anything he had ever seen. Its surface shimmered like molten gold, and strange patterns adorned its skin, spiraling in intricate designs. His stomach growled again, and he took a step closer. Was this edible? It didn't look poisonous, and besides, he couldn't resist the urge. Carefully, he reached out and lifted the container. The lid slid off with ease, and the fruit seemed to hum in his hands. Without hesitation, he sank his teeth into it. A sudden heat flared through his body, igniting every nerve. He dropped to his knees, clutching his chest as fire spread through his veins. He wanted to scream, but no sound came out. His vision blurred, and the world tilted. For a moment, he thought he might die. But then it stopped. Naruto gasped for breath, sweat pouring down his face. He looked at his hands, expecting burns, but found nothing. Instead, a faint golden glow pulsed beneath his skin. Panic surged through him. What had he just done? The answer came swiftly. A rustling in the bushes made him whirl around. Villagers. They had followed him. Their eyes burned with hatred, and their weapons gleamed in the dim light. One of them stepped forward, a kunai raised. Demon brat, the man spat. We should have killed you long ago. Naruto stumbled back, heart pounding. Wait. I didn't do anything. But they didn't listen. The first man lunged, and Naruto barely managed to dodge. Pain exploded in his side as another blade slashed him. Blood soaked his shirt. He fell to the ground, gasping. The villagers closed in, and for the first time, Naruto felt true despair. He didn't want to die. Not like this. Not hated. Not alone. And then it happened. A golden light erupted from his body, blinding his attackers. His wounds closed instantly, and before he could process it, his body shifted. Feathers erupted from his skin, and massive wings spread wide. Fire engulfed him, but it didn't burn. Instead, it felt comforting, like a warm embrace. The villagers screamed and stumbled back as Naruto let out a cry, a piercing, bird-like scream that shook the trees. He rose into the air, flames trailing behind him. The sensation was exhilarating and terrifying all at once. What am I? He whispered, staring at his reflection in a pool of water below. A phoenix. He had become a phoenix. The villagers fled, their shouts fading into the distance. Naruto landed, his body shifting back to normal. He fell to his knees, trembling. What had he done? What had he become? But as the fear subsided, another emotion took its place. Rage. They had tried to kill him. Again. For something he had no control over. No one had ever given him a chance. They called him a demon, and now, maybe they were right. Maybe he was a monster. But if he was going to be hated, if he was going to be feared, then he would make sure it was for a reason. Naruto clenched his fists, fire flickering around his fingers. "No more," he hissed. "I won't be weak anymore. I won't let them hurt me." The glow in his skin flared brighter, and the flames danced around him. He looked toward the village, his eyes burning with determination. The boy who had once dreamed of being Hokage was gone. In his place stood something new. Something stronger. And Konoha would learn to fear him. He turned and vanished into the depths of the forest, leaving only scorched earth and dying embers in his wake. The world Naruto had known for so long was no more. The bright-eyed boy who once dreamed of becoming Hokage, earning the villagers' respect, now stood at the precipice of something far darker. The flames that had awakened within him burned with an intensity he couldn't ignore. No longer was he simply a child of the hidden leaf, desperate for validation. He was something else. Something far beyond them all. Naruto had spent days in seclusion, far from the prying eyes of Konoha. He retreated into the vast forests that surrounded the village, where the trees whispered secrets of the earth, and the air tasted sharp and pure. Here, in the solitude of nature, he began to experiment with the flames that had manifested after his awakening. These flames were unlike anything he had ever seen or heard of before. They weren't just destructive, they were regenerating, burning through everything they touched, and then bringing it back, as if the fire itself had learned to live and breathe. The flames, each flickering tendril, coiled around his body as if they recognized him as their master. He stretched out his hand, and the fire followed, encircling him, filling his very being with an overwhelming sense of power. It wasn't just heat, it was a connection to something primal, something godlike. As he focused, he could feel the flame seep into his skin, strengthening him, mending the smallest wounds as if time itself had reversed. The pain he had suffered in the past, the neglect, the abuse, it all seemed so distant now. In its place, a sense of invulnerability enveloped him. Naruto grinned, watching the flames dance in front of him. He leaped into the air, experimenting with flight. It was a strange, liberating sensation. His body lifted effortlessly off the ground, weightless as though he were untethered from the world below. His thoughts, once consumed with thoughts of revenge, began to shift. What was he now? Was he even human anymore? He knew that no one, not even the Hokage, would understand this power, let alone accept it. They would fear him, and fear was the perfect tool for someone like him. He had learned that the greatest power came not from being loved but from being feared. His mind drifted to the villagers who had turned their backs on him, their whispers echoing in his memory. They feared him as a child, yes, but that fear was based on ignorance. Now, he had something far worse, the power to turn that fear into terror. Naruto could feel his immortality, the regenerating flames that surged through him. He was untouchable. His wounds healed before they could even form, his muscles grew stronger with every passing moment, his senses sharper. The very concept of death seemed foreign to him now, a thing that belonged to lesser beings. He was a force, a creature that had transcended human limitations. And Konoha? Konoha would soon learn what it meant to cross him. It didn't take long for word of his transformation to spread throughout the village. The whispers began in small, tight-knit groups but soon grew louder, more urgent. Have you seen him? The demon child. One villager would say, their eyes wide with fear. He's not human anymore, another would add, their voice trembling. The villagers were right to fear him. Naruto was no longer the scorned orphan boy, he had become something far worse, something they couldn't even begin to comprehend. And as the rumors spread, the Hokage, ever the protector of Konoha, knew that something had to be done. The growing unease in the village was palpable, and there were some who demanded that Naruto be dealt with before he became too powerful. Danzo, ever scheming, saw an opportunity. It must be stopped now, before it gets out of hand, he suggested. He is a threat to the village's safety. We cannot let him run rampant. Tsunade and Jiraiya had their doubts, but in the face of growing public outcry and pressure, the decision was made. Naruto would be eliminated. A small squad of elite shinobi was dispatched to confront him in the forests where he had been hiding. They were armed with special seals, weapons designed to suppress chakra, and various jutsus meant to contain the monster they believed Naruto had become. The squad of shinobi moved quickly, unaware that they were walking into a trap. Naruto had already sensed their approach, his heightened senses picking up the faintest traces of chakra in the air. He stood waiting, his flames swirling around him like a cloak of molten energy. His eyes, glowing with an otherworldly light, watched the shinobi approach from the distance. The squad stopped just outside his range. "Naruto Uzumaki, you are to come with us," the lead shinobi commanded, his voice carrying an edge of authority. Naruto's laugh broke the silence, a low, menacing chuckle that echoed through the trees. "Come with you? You think you can just order me around?" The shinobi hesitated, sensing the dangerous shift in the air. One of them tried to step forward, but before they could react, Naruto's flames surged, roaring to life like a wild beast. He thrust his hand forward, and the fire followed swift, unforgiving, and lethal. The first shinobi was consumed in an instant, his body dissolving into ash as the flames engulfed him. The others scrambled, trying to dodge the oncoming inferno, but it was futile. Naruto's flames didn't just burn, they eradicated, vaporizing everything they touched. The flames swirled in the air, twisting and contorting as if they had a mind of their own, guiding Naruto's will. "Is this what you wanted?" Naruto sneered, his voice echoing through the forest. "To come and try to kill me like I'm just another threat?" Another shinobi tried to activate a seal, hoping to suppress Naruto's powers, but it was too late. Naruto raised his hand, and the flames swirled around him, blasting the seal away before it could take effect. The others attempted to form hand seals, but their movements were slow, sluggish compared to the overwhelming speed of Naruto's power. "Pathetic," Naruto muttered, his voice dark and full of disdain. In a single, fluid motion, he snapped his fingers. The flames erupted in every direction, engulfing the squad in a blaze so hot that the air itself seemed to warp. The heat was unbearable, the intensity of it so great that the surrounding trees began to catch fire, their trunks blackening and crumbling to ash. When the flames finally died down, nothing was left of the squad except smoldering ashes. The forest had been scorched, the trees reduced to cinders, and Naruto stood in the center of the devastation, untouched and triumphant. The sky above him seemed to reflect his inner storm, dark clouds swirling ominously. As he floated above the ground, his flames crackling around him like an eternal aura, he knew that Konoha had just witnessed the beginning of something far greater. The villagers had sent their best to kill him, but they had only brought their own destruction. Naruto turned and began to walk back toward the village. The air felt different now, charged with an energy that could not be denied. His mind was set, there was no going back. Konoha had rejected him, cast him aside as a monster. Now, he would be the one to decide their fate. And so, as he made his way toward the heart of the village, the flames of rebirth burned brighter within him, casting an infernal glow over everything he touched. The flames that would consume Konoha had just begun to take form. Nothing would stop him now. Naruto's departure from Konoha was not a quiet one. The blood had barely cooled on the smoldering earth where his enemies once stood when he felt the weight of the village's hatred begin to swell. They would come for him. They would try to stop him. But Naruto knew, deep down, that this was only the beginning. Konoha, with all its pretensions of peace and order, had failed him. Now, it would burn for its betrayal. But first, he needed to leave. The night was his ally, as it had always been, and under the cover of darkness, Naruto fled. He moved with the fluidity of a shadow, barely leaving a trace. His chakra flowed like an ocean beneath his skin, and the fire that swirled around him seemed to flicker with an unnatural life. It had been hours since the massacre, but the flames that had been unleashed in the forest still burned within him, an eternal reminder of the path he had chosen. His feet carried him beyond the village's borders, into the dense, unforgiving wilderness that separated Konoha from the rest of the elemental nations. Here, in the wild, where the mountains rose sharp and the trees reached for the heavens, he found a kind of solace. The air smelled different here, sharper, cleaner. It was a place where he could be alone, free from the whispers of those who had once called him a hero. He no longer cared for them. Naruto settled into a cave nestled in the side of a jagged cliff. The darkness of the cave was suffocating, but he found comfort in its quiet isolation. The cool air tasted of stone and earth, and it was here that he began to train in earnest. The flames that had once surged uncontrollably now responded to his will with a deadly precision. He could feel them pulse through him, as though they were an extension of his very being. He focused, reaching deep into his core, drawing on the power that seemed endless, that had been awakened by his rage. The flames responded to his thoughts, and with the flick of his wrist, a tendril of fire shot from his palm, coiling and twisting in the air before dissipating into nothingness. It was beautiful, in its own chaotic way, and it was his. Days turned into weeks, and the fire continued to grow within him. Naruto began to experiment with partial transformations, his body shifting and contorting into something more, something other. His skin hardened, taking on a dark, charred appearance, and his eyes glowed with an eerie light as if they were windows into a world of unspoken power. His chakra mixed with the flames, creating an explosive force that could tear through mountains, and yet, there was a strange calmness in it. But it was not enough. Naruto's desire to perfect this power, to push beyond even his own understanding of it, consumed him. Every day, he would push his limits, molding the flames into ever more dangerous forms. There were moments when his flames would burn too hot, too fierce, and he would find himself engulfed by them. But each time, his body would heal, his form would reform, and he would rise again, stronger than before. There was no end to his evolution, there was no ceiling to his power. Then came the day when he attempted his full transformation. Naruto had long been experimenting with the idea of fully embodying the fire, of becoming a being of pure flame, a creature of destruction and rebirth. The day he achieved it was marked by a crackling storm of energy, as the flames enveloped him completely. He felt his form dissipate, like smoke caught in the wind, and yet he remained. His body was no longer bound by flesh and bone. It was pure fire, a raging inferno that could tear apart the very fabric of reality. The transformation was exhilarating, a kind of freedom he had never known. He soared through the skies, leaving trails of molten fire behind him, a streak of death and destruction in his wake. His power was boundless. He was no longer human, he was something greater, something terrifying. But as the days passed, Naruto found himself returning to the cave, the place where his journey had begun. He could feel the emptiness of the space around him, the weight of isolation pressing in on him. The flames that had once been his salvation now seemed to mock him. What good was power if it was nothing more than a tool for destruction? He had no home. No family. No purpose. It was during one of these moments of self-reflection that he felt the presence of someone else, a familiar chakra signature piercing through the thick veil of his isolation. He had hoped it wouldn't come to this, but deep down, he had known. They would send someone. It was inevitable. Jiraiya. The man who had once taken Naruto under his wing, trained him, and shared with him stories of a world beyond the walls of Konoha, was now on his way. It was not out of love, not out of care for Naruto's well-being, but out of duty. Jiraiya was one of the few who had a connection to the past Naruto had left behind. He had to try to stop him, to bring him back. Naruto could hear the old man's footsteps approaching the cave, steady but cautious. Jiraiya had always been strong, a formidable force in his own right, But now he was just another relic of a world Naruto had left behind. When Jiraiya entered the cave, his eyes widened in shock. The transformation Naruto had undergone was far beyond anything he had expected. The cave, once a quiet sanctuary, now hummed with the crackling energy of Naruto's flames, which danced in the air, illuminating the shadows with an eerie light. Naruto, Jiraiya's voice was filled with a mixture of disbelief and sorrow. What have you done? What is this power? Naruto stood, his form shifting between solid and ethereal, a mass of fire and shadow. His eyes, glowing with an unnatural light, locked onto Jiraiya's. He felt no connection to the man anymore, no pull of affection, no longing for the bond they had once shared. Power. Naruto scoffed, his voice cold and sharp, like the crackling of fire. This isn't power, Jiraiya. This is freedom. This is who I was always meant to be. This pathetic village, they thought they could control me. They thought they could cast me aside and treat me like a pariah. Now, I'm beyond their reach. I'm beyond everyone. Jiraiya's expression softened, the weight of his failure pressing down on him. Naruto, you don't have to do this. You're not alone. You never were. I failed you, but you don't have to give up on everything. Naruto laughed, the sound echoing off the cave walls like the crackling of a wildfire. You failed me? No, Jiraiya. You never understood me. None of you did. You think I wanted to be alone? You think I wanted to burn Konoha to the ground? But you all abandoned me. You all betrayed me. Jiraiya stepped forward, his hand reaching out, trying to make contact, trying to reach the boy he had once known. Naruto, please. This path won't lead you to happiness. It will only lead to destruction. I won't let you go down this road. You have to come back. Naruto's eyes flared with rage, and in an instant, the air around him turned into a searing inferno. His flames lashed out, but he held back just enough to avoid harming Jiraiya. He wasn't interested in killing the old man, not yet. Instead, he simply wanted to show him how weak he was. You really think you can stop me? Naruto sneered. Look at you. You're nothing but a relic of a broken world, trying to save someone who doesn't need saving. Jiraiya's eyes filled with pain as he stopped in his tracks. Naruto. With a flick of his wrist, Naruto sent a wave of fire crashing toward Jiraiya. But just as quickly, he pulled it back, leaving the men unscathed. It was a mockery. A way to show him how outclassed he was. You're lucky, Naruto said coldly. I don't feel like killing you today. But don't come back here again. You can't stop what's already been set in motion. Jiraiya stood still for a moment, as if processing the weight of Naruto's words. Then, without another word, he turned and walked away, his shoulders slumped in defeat. He knew that he couldn't bring Naruto back, not now, not in this state. Naruto watched him leave, his heart cold, his mind a maelstrom of thoughts. He felt nothing for the man who had once been his mentor. Nothing but contempt. Nothing but the growing, insatiable fire within him. As Jiraiya disappeared into the night, Naruto let the flames die down, sinking into the darkness of the cave. He had no need for them anymore. He was alone, and that was all that mattered. He would evolve. He would rise. And when he did, the world would burn. The world had become a blur of unrelenting motion. In his secluded cave, Naruto had spent months honing his powers, each day an endless cycle of fire and fury. The flames were no longer just tools, they were his identity. Each crackle, each eruption of heat, was a part of him, and he had become a being of destruction, rebirth, and unchallenged supremacy. Yet even in the vast solitude, the thoughts of Konoha never left him. It was the very place that had cast him aside, the place that had rejected him. And it was from this very village that the world had witnessed his power, a power that could bend the earth itself to his will. But now, It was time. Time to return to the village that had once been his home, the place that had spurned him. It was no longer the boy who sought acceptance. He had ascended far beyond that pathetic desire. Naruto was something more now. He was a force, a living nightmare. The moment his feet touched the ground at the edge of the village, the air around him crackled with raw energy. The earth seemed to tremble beneath him as though it feared what he had become. Naruto stood there, for just a moment, staring at the gates that once confined him. The very walls that had once been his prison now seemed fragile, like they were made of paper, easily torn apart by his flames. He took a step forward, and the ground beneath him split open, a surge of fire shooting through the earth, signaling his arrival. The very sky seemed to darken, as though acknowledging his return. Naruto smirked. There would be no resistance. Within moments, the Hokage guards, the strongest warriors of Konoha, had gathered at the village gates, ready to defend their home. But they were nothing compared to him. He was not a mere shinobi anymore. He was a god of fire, a being that defied the limits of human existence. His flames rose like pillars of rage, and his very presence crushed their resolve. The first wave of guards charged at him, weapons drawn. But Naruto's eyes flared with an unnatural light. He raised his hand, and a wave of flame erupted from his palm, a tidal wave of molten destruction. The guards, too slow to react, were consumed by the fire in an instant. Their screams were drowned by the roaring inferno as their bodies were reduced to ash in the blink of an eye. Naruto advanced, each step effortless, like a king walking through his domain. The few remaining guards, those that had managed to avoid the flames, hesitated for a moment. But it was futile. The distance between them and their adversary seemed to stretch impossibly wide. One by one, they fell before him, burned, crushed, and broken until no one stood in his way. The village itself was unaware of the destruction unfolding at its gates. But Naruto knew the moment had come. He had to make them see. He had to make them feel the terror that had been etched into his soul all those years. The villagers needed to witness his power, to understand that they had no hope of resisting him. With a gesture, Naruto sent a wave of flame toward the center of the village. The streets burst into flames as his fire spiraled outward, consuming the buildings that once stood as symbols of Konoha's strength. The heat was so intense that the very air seemed to shimmer with the oppressive weight of his wrath. The cries of the villagers, who had rushed to flee their burning homes, filled the air, but Naruto felt no empathy. They were nothing but insects in his path. And then, there she was. Tsunade, the fifth Hokage, stood at the top of the Hokage's tower, staring down at him. Her expression was one of defiance, but there was no mistaking the fear in her eyes. She knew what he had become. She knew the power he wielded. But she was the Hokage, the leader of Konoha. She would not surrender without a fight. Naruto gazed up at her, his smirk widening as he felt the flames surge within him. He could feel the heat building inside him, ready to explode. But instead of unleashing his fury, he let it simmer, savoring the moment. Tsunade's stubbornness amused him, even if it was ultimately meaningless. "You're still as arrogant as ever, Tsunade," Naruto called out, his voice carrying over the chaos. "But you know it's pointless, don't you? Your village is already mine. Your shinobi are dead. You, too, will fall." Tsunade's eyes narrowed, her hands tightening into fists. She was not one to back down, but she knew the truth. This was a battle she could not win. She had no intention of surrendering, but she understood that sometimes, survival came at the cost of pride. She leaped from the tower, landing in front of him with a force that cracked the ground beneath her feet. Her chakra flared to life as she formed the seals for her strongest jutsu. But Naruto was already ahead of her. With a flick of his wrist, he summoned a wall of fire, creating a barrier between them. The flames swirled, blocking Tsunade's attack before it even had a chance to materialize. "Stop playing around," Naruto said with a growl. You can't stop me. You should have surrendered the moment I walked into your village. This is your last chance, Tsunade. Surrender, and your people will live. Resist, and they will burn. Tsunade hesitated, her gaze flicking to the village around her. The flames spread faster now, and the cries of the people grew more frantic. She could see that Naruto's power was not something she could fight. The flames were consuming everything in their path, and with each passing second, more lives were lost. But there was one thing Tsunade knew in her heart: she would not bend to him. Not while she still had breath. Never, she spat. Naruto's eyes flashed with fury. He had no patience for her defiance. Without warning, he unleashed a massive wave of fire, sending it crashing toward Tsunade. She summoned her own power, creating a shield of chakra to protect herself, but it was futile. The flames overwhelmed her defenses, the heat searing through her protection like paper in a furnace. Tsunade was forced to her knees, gasping for breath, her body shaking from the immense pressure. But even as the heat threatened to consume her, she lifted her head, her eyes locking onto Naruto's. She was beaten. She knew it. But she would not let him see her surrender so easily. Naruto slowly stepped forward, the flames at his back rippling with his every movement. He looked down at her with a gaze that was cold, calculating. You're not a fool, Tsunade. You know this is over. The village is mine. Your life is mine. He held out his hand, and the flames surged forward once again, not to kill her, but to mark her. He burned his symbol into her skin, a sigil of submission, a mark that would bind her to him. As the fire licked at her skin, she let out a pained gasp, but there was no resistance left in her. When the flames receded, the mark was there, glowing with an unearthly light. Tsunade was no longer the Hokage. She was nothing but a servant to the Phoenix King. Naruto stood over her, his expression triumphant. This village belongs to me now. And you, Tsunade, are my first subject. From now on, you will serve me. You will bow before me, just like everyone else. He turned away, raising his hand to signal the beginning of his reign. The villagers, who had been watching in fear and awe, now saw the truth. There would be no resistance. No rebellion. There was only the Phoenix King. Only him. Naruto's flames spread, marking every corner of Konoha with his symbol, his mark of absolute power. The villagers, once free to live as they wished, were now bound to him, their will no longer their own. Every one of them would carry his sigil, an eternal reminder that they now belonged to him. His slaves. His followers. And in the distance, the world trembled. Word of his return spread across the land, carried on the wind like a whisper of impending doom. The Phoenix King had risen. And nothing would stand in his way. The flames of Konoha had not yet settled when Naruto's vision of dominance began to unfold beyond the village. He had become an unstoppable force, more than just a man, more than a god. The very earth trembled beneath his steps, and the world, once filled with so many stubbornly defiant lands, was now ripe for the taking. There was no end to his ambitions, no limit to his power. His immortality was a chain binding him to a future where he reigned unchallenged, and the world would burn in his image. Naruto was no longer just the ruler of Konoha, he had become the Phoenix King, and his domain extended far beyond the walls of the village that had once rejected him. The winds carried his name across the land, whispers of terror and awe, of villages that crumbled to nothing before his flames. It was inevitable every stronghold, every corner of the elemental nations would fall under his will. And no one would be spared from the cleansing fire. At his command, his forces, those who had willingly bent the knee or been burned into submission, marched out. They spread like a disease, their ranks growing with every village they conquered. Naruto's symbol, the mark of his flames, was branded upon the foreheads of every soul he enslaved. The villages that resisted were scorched to ash, their people burned away in a world-changing firestorm. But even as his power expanded, there was one village that had caught his eye. A place known for its desert sands, where warriors were born from the harshest conditions. The Sand Village. He had heard rumors of their strength, of their leadership, of their powerful Jinchuriki Gaara. It didn't matter to Naruto. He had no time for weaklings, no patience for the underlings who believed themselves to be more than they were. The sand would fall, like all the others, beneath his flames. His army marched across the land, bringing the firestorm with them. As they neared the borders of the Sand Village, Naruto's heart burned with a particular kind of anticipation. His flames were insatiable, but they had yet to meet a true challenge. He would be the one to end their will, to extinguish the stubborn flicker of resistance. The first signs of the Sand Village's resistance came in the form of a counterattack. The sand itself began to rise as if it had a mind of its own. Shikaku, Gaara's beast, began to manifest, the air vibrating with its presence. Naruto smirked. It was a threat, but nothing that could compare to his fire. The very essence of this Jinchuriki's power was as fleeting as the sand in the wind, nothing but a weak, primal force that would burn just like everything else. Gaara stood at the forefront of his village, his eyes hard and unwavering. His sand clashed against Naruto's advancing flames, but it was clear from the beginning that he was outmatched. Each wave of sand that surged toward Naruto was consumed by an eruption of fire, the flames rising higher with each new attempt. The desert itself seemed to heat under the pressure of Naruto's presence, the very air thick with the promise of destruction. Gaara's eyes narrowed, his sand churning around him like a protective barrier. "You are nothing but a destroyer," he spat, his voice hoarse with fury. "You think your flames will defeat me? I will protect my village until my last breath." Naruto stopped in his tracks, the heat from his body causing the ground beneath him to crack. His laughter was low, like the rumble of thunder before a storm. "Your last breath will come soon enough, Gaara," he taunted. "And I'll make sure the world knows your name. They'll remember you as the one who tried to stand against me and failed." Without warning, Naruto raised his hand to the sky, and a massive firestorm erupted from the ground around him. The flames seemed to devour the desert itself, spiraling upward in a whirlwind of molten heat. Gaara's sand tried to shield him, but the intensity of the fire was too much. The sand was burned away in seconds, and the heat was unlike anything Gaara had ever felt before. With a single wave of his hand, Naruto sent a concentrated blast of fire directly toward Gaara, the flames twisting with such force that they tore through the sand, the heat so intense that the air itself seemed to combust. Gaara attempted to shield himself with his sand, but it was useless. The fire consumed him, and the very desert around him melted, turning to glass beneath the fury of the flames. Tears welled in Gaara's eyes, not from pain, but from the realization that he had failed. The beast that had once been his only companion, his source of strength, had been nothing more than a futile shield against an unstoppable force. His body was already burning, his vision blurring with smoke and heat, but his spirit was broken long before the flames reached him. Naruto stood tall, his expression one of cold indifference. Gaara's form crumbled into nothingness, his body reduced to ash by the sheer power of Naruto's flames. The village watched in stunned silence, the screams of their fallen leader echoing across the sand. The Phoenix King had struck. The victory was swift and brutal. No one in the Sand Village had the strength to oppose Naruto. His forces swept through the streets, overwhelming the villagers with ease, their resistance extinguished by the sheer force of Naruto's will. The survivors were enslaved, their bodies branded with the symbol of the Phoenix King as a reminder that their lives were now his to control. Naruto gazed out over the ashes of the village, feeling the warmth of the flames that had reduced it to nothing more than a memory. This was only the beginning. With Gaara's death, his power, his influence, would spread even further. The message was clear: no village was safe from the Phoenix King. But as Naruto's forces moved to consolidate control over the newly conquered lands, a shadow began to stir. The Akatsuki, a group that had long remained in the shadows, monitoring the balance of power in the world, had taken notice of Naruto's rise. His flames had reached their ears, and they knew that they could no longer remain passive in the face of his overwhelming power. A meeting was held in the dark, silent chambers where the leaders of the Akatsuki gathered. Pain, their leader, stood at the forefront, his eyes narrowed with suspicion. "This Phoenix King," he spoke coldly. "His power surpasses that of any shinobi we have encountered. His flames are unlike anything we've seen. If he is allowed to continue unchecked, he will consume the world." The members of the Akatsuki, those who had once been rivals, now found themselves in an uneasy alliance. Each had their own motivations for challenging Naruto, but they were united by a common goal: stop the Phoenix King before he destroyed everything they had worked for. "He must be stopped," Itachi Uchiha said, his voice low and contemplative. "But we must approach this carefully. His flames are not something we can defeat with brute strength alone." The meeting continued in hushed tones, the Akatsuki strategizing, planning their next move. They knew that Naruto was not a threat they could take lightly. If they wanted to defeat him, they would have to strike at his very heart, the source of his power. Naruto, meanwhile, was oblivious to the plotting that took place behind the scenes. He had already begun to focus on his next conquest, his flames spreading further and further across the elemental nations. The village of the mist was next. And once he had claimed it, there would be no one left to stand against him. As his flames grew in power, so did his ambition. He was not content to simply conquer the villages of the elemental nations. He wanted more. He would spread his fire to every corner of the world, and those who resisted would burn. His flames were the harbinger of a new world, one where he would reign supreme, the Phoenix King. And the Akatsuki, once a powerful organization in their own right, now found themselves scrambling to stop a force unlike any they had ever faced. But Naruto's flames were unyielding, and as the fire of conquest spread across the land, no one, neither friend nor foe, would escape his grasp. The sun dipped low on the horizon, casting a fiery glow over the landscape, as Naruto stood at the edge of a small cliff, gazing out at the villages he had conquered. His flames had scorched the earth, and his presence had become an unstoppable force that rippled through the world. The Phoenix King had burned through the lands, laying waste to any who dared oppose him, and he reveled in the sense of control that came with his overwhelming power. His immortality made him untouchable. His flames, an extension of his will, annihilated everything in his path. He had reached the pinnacle of his strength, and no one dared challenge him, no one, except for them. A shadow loomed behind him, something far more dangerous than the villages he had burned. The Akatsuki, the self-proclaimed keepers of balance in the world, had finally decided to move against him. They had been watching from the shadows, their eyes set on Naruto, calculating his every move. His strength was undeniable, but it was also his greatest flaw. The Akatsuki believed that, through cunning and strategy, they could strip him of his immortality and take his power for themselves. Naruto had long since sensed their presence, their movements like the murmurings of a storm that had yet to break. He smirked to himself. It was time to end this farce. He knew they were coming. It was inevitable. The flames had drawn them in like moths to a flame. And, just like every other fool who sought to challenge him, they would be consumed in the fire. It was dusk when they struck, silent and deadly. Pain, the leader of the Akatsuki, had led the charge, his eyes calculating, his mind already plotting their first move. But the power Naruto wielded was far beyond anything they could have imagined. They moved in, surrounding him with a deadly precision, their eyes fixed on their goal. They believed, for a fleeting moment, that they could break through his defenses. That they could take him down. Pain raised his hand, signaling the attack. Now, he shouted. The Akatsuki attacked from all sides. Deidara unleashed his clay bombs, massive explosions that tore through the air. Sasuke's puppets surged forward, their blades aimed to strike at Naruto's heart. Hidan and Kakozu moved in close, hoping to overwhelm him with their deadly combination of endurance and ferocity. But Naruto wasn't concerned. He stood motionless, waiting for them to make their move. As the first wave of explosions roared toward him, Naruto's eyes flashed with the intensity of a wildfire. Without lifting a finger, he released his flames. The fire burst forth like a tidal wave, consuming the entire battlefield. The clay bombs disintegrated mid-air, the sand and explosives turning to nothing as the flames swallowed them. The puppets were nothing more than cinders, their wooden frames splintering and cracking in the heat. Hidan and Kakozu's attacks were incinerated before they could even reach him. In an instant, half of the Akatsuki forces were reduced to ash. The remaining members of the Akatsuki, stunned by the sheer force of the flames, regrouped. Pain stood tall, his 6 paths of pain surrounding him, ready to retaliate. The flames had failed to burn him, but the power that Naruto had displayed was beyond comprehension. The remaining members knew that they could not simply charge him head-on. Itachi Uchiha, ever the tactician, was quick to assess the situation. He felt the weight of his own power, his eyes narrowing as he studied Naruto's form. The flames, the heat, the destructive power, it was all-consuming. Itachi was no stranger to overwhelming power, having wielded the Sharingan to subdue countless opponents, but this was something else entirely. As the battle raged on, Naruto's flames burned hotter, pushing the Akatsuki back with each surge. His regeneration was unparalleled. Any wound he received was immediately healed by the flames, and his speed was a blur as he avoided every attack thrown at him. There was no strategy that could defeat him. There was no strength that could overpower him. He was, for all intents and purposes, a god among men. Naruto's laughter echoed through the battlefield, mocking the Akatsuki's efforts. "Is this all you have?" he taunted. Pathetic. With a single thought, Naruto's flames surged again, this time targeting the remaining members. The destructive heat tore through the battlefield, annihilating everything in its path. Only a few remained standing: Pain, Itachi, Konan, and Zetsu. The others had been consumed by the flames, reduced to ashes in the blink of an eye. Pain, his expression hardening, faced Naruto head-on, his 6 bodies shifting in perfect synchronization. "We will not fall so easily," he declared. "We will take your immortality from you and use it for our own purposes." Naruto smirked. "You really think you can take what's mine? You're all just ants to me." Pain's eyes flashed with anger. The Rinnegan glowed as he summoned the full power of his 6 bodies. "We have the power to destroy entire villages. You are nothing but a fleeting illusion." Naruto's gaze darkened. The flames around him intensified, the air growing thick with the heat. Without hesitation, he unleashed a massive wave of fire, obliterating the 6 paths of pain with ease. Each body crumbled under the heat, the flames disintegrating them to nothing. The power of the Rinnegan had been impressive, but it was powerless against Naruto's inferno. Pain stood alone now, the remnants of his power flickering weakly in his hands. Itachi, having watched the devastation unfold, stepped forward. His eyes were filled with a sense of awe and realization. He had seen godlike power before, but this was something beyond comprehension. Itachi's voice was calm, resigned. "We cannot defeat him," he said, turning to Pain. "It is over." Pain's shoulders slumped, his gaze dropping to the ground. Itachi's words carried the weight of defeat. The Akatsuki, in all its power, had been no match for the Phoenix King. Itachi, without hesitation, fell to his knees before Naruto, his expression filled with respect and submission. "I offer my services to you," he said quietly. "We cannot defeat you. I will serve you, Phoenix King." Naruto stared down at him, a smirk playing at the corners of his mouth. Itachi's pride had always been his defining trait, and now, To see him surrender so easily was a testament to the magnitude of Naruto's power. Naruto had always been able to break the spirits of those who stood before him, but Itachi was different. He saw the futility of resistance, the inevitability of his own failure. Naruto extended his hand, his voice cold. "You are wise, Itachi. Join me. Serve me, and you will live. Disobey, and you will burn like the rest." Itachi's eyes met Naruto's, his Sharingan blazing with a quiet acceptance. "I will serve." With that, Itachi became the first member of the Akatsuki to pledge allegiance to Naruto. Pain, his body shattered and broken, had no choice but to surrender as well. Naruto's flames had left them with no other option. The Akatsuki was no more. Its former members were now part of Naruto's ever-growing empire. He had defeated them with ease, and in doing so, had solidified his rule over the world. His army had grown, not just with force, but with loyalty. Itachi's quiet submission had marked the beginning of a new chapter in Naruto's reign. The flames had cleansed the battlefield, and Naruto stood victorious, his power now unchallenged. He had destroyed the Akatsuki, taken their strength, and molded them into his own. The world was his, and there was no one left to stand against him. And as the smoke cleared and the flames began to die down, Naruto knew that this was only the beginning. The world would bend to his will. His conquest was far from over. The landscape was a bleak reflection of the Phoenix King's reign. The once beautiful villages he had conquered were now transformed into desolate, smoldering ruins, their survivors forced into servitude under his iron rule. His flames had burned away all resistance, and in their place, fear had taken root. The world, now under the heel of Naruto, was divided into territories. Each was ruled by a selected few, branded by the very fire that gave Naruto his immortality. These marks, seared into the flesh of his followers, were both a symbol of loyalty and a reminder of the consequences of disobedience. Betrayal, no matter how small, was met with swift and unrelenting judgment. Naruto had long since ceased to care for the lives of the weak and the powerless. His flames were the ultimate authority, and they consumed any who dared to defy him. He was a king without mercy, his temper as volatile as the fire that coursed through his veins. His word was law, and those who broke it faced a fate far worse than death. For in his eyes, death was too kind for the disobedient. No, the punishment for such insolence was far more final. He had established a council of loyal followers, each responsible for enforcing his rule across the territories he had claimed. They answered to him alone, their loyalty sealed in the flames he had gifted them. But despite his growing empire, Naruto remained unsatisfied. His power was absolute, yet something was missing, something he could not quite name. Perhaps it was the absence of a true equal, or perhaps it was the emptiness that followed the annihilation of his enemies. Regardless, he knew that the world would kneel before him, and soon, the entire elemental nations would be his to command. One evening, as he sat upon his throne of scorched stone, a figure approached him, one that stood out from the others. She was quiet, her face obscured by a veil of dark hair, but her presence was undeniable. It was Hinata. Once a fragile, timid girl from the Hidden Leaf, now a woman who had been forced into the chains of servitude. Yet, even in her submission, there was something in her eyes that caught Naruto's attention. A flicker of defiance, of courage. Hinata stood before him, trembling, but not from fear. It was a different kind of fear that gripped her, fear for those who had been crushed under Naruto's rule, fear for the lives he had destroyed with his flames. The people who had trusted in him, only to find themselves betrayed by the very one who had once been a hero to them. "Please, Naruto-sama," she pleaded, her voice soft but unwavering. "Spare them. They have suffered enough." Naruto's gaze shifted to her, his eyes cold, yet filled with an unsettling curiosity. He had always been a creature of destruction, a being that thrived on chaos, but something about Hinata's plea stirred something within him, a recognition of the part of him he had buried long ago, the part that had once known compassion. He studied her, his eyes lingering on her every move, her desperate but sincere expression. "Spare them," he repeated, his voice dripping with disdain. "Why would I spare them? They are nothing more than pawns, insignificant in the grand scheme of my empire. They serve me, or they burn." Hinata's eyes fell to the ground, but she refused to bow. She was not like the others who cowered before him. "They don't deserve to die, Naruto-sama. You've already taken everything from them. What more do you want?" Naruto's gaze darkened, his temper flaring. His hands clenched into fists, the flames around him rising in response to his anger. But Hinata did not flinch. She stood tall, though her voice trembled slightly. "You have power, Naruto-sama. More power than anyone could ever dream of. But that power doesn't make you invincible. It doesn't make you human. You've forgotten what it means to care for others, to protect them. You've become a tyrant." The words struck him like a blow to the chest. His mind reeled, caught in a moment of hesitation. No one had ever dared speak to him in such a way. No one had ever tried to reach the man he had become. In all his conquests, all his battles, he had never once allowed himself to feel anything for the people he had destroyed. They were beneath him, insignificant. But Hinata's words. They lingered, gnawing at him in a way that no enemy's blade ever had. "I haven't forgotten," Naruto murmured, his voice low and dangerous. "I simply chose to let go of weakness." Hinata didn't back down. "Then why did you spare me?" Naruto's eyes flickered, and for a brief moment, something shifted within him. He stared at her, his thoughts swirling. Why had he spared her? He had killed countless people without hesitation, without remorse. But there was something different about Hinata. Something about her unwavering determination, her quiet strength, drew him in. "I don't know," he confessed, almost to himself. "You're different." She nodded, as if she understood something he didn't. "I know you're not beyond redemption, Naruto-sama. You don't have to be a monster. You can still change." The words hit him harder than anything else had. He looked at her, really looked at her, and saw the sincerity in her eyes. She was right. He could change. But would he? Would he return to the path he had once walked, or was he too far gone, consumed by the very flames that had made him a god among men? Naruto's flames flickered and died down, his anger slowly dissipating. He was silent for a long while, lost in thought. Finally, he spoke, his voice soft and contemplative. "I spared you because you remind me of who I used to be," he said. "The part of me that still cared. But that part of me is dead. There is only the Phoenix King now." Hinata stepped forward, her heart pounding in her chest. She could see the battle within him, the struggle between the man he had been and the monster he had become. She reached out, placing her hand on his arm, her touch gentle but firm. "Then let me help you remember who you are, Naruto-sama," she said softly. "Let me help you find a way back." Naruto looked down at her hand, his mind racing. He could feel the warmth of her touch, a stark contrast to the coldness that had taken root in his soul. His gaze lifted to meet hers, and for the first time in a long time, he felt something stir deep inside him, a flicker of hope, of possibility. "You want to help me?" he asked, his voice hoarse. Hinata nodded. "I do." Naruto studied her, his heart torn between the darkness that had consumed him and the faint, dying light of the person he had once been. He had the power to destroy her, to burn her away like he had done to so many others. But in her eyes, he saw something that no one else had shown him in years: compassion. He reached out, his hand touching her cheek, his touch gentle yet firm. "You're foolish," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "But I will spare you. For now. Hinata's eyes softened, and she smiled, though her heart was heavy. She had reached him, just a little. It wasn't much, but it was a start. Thank you, she whispered. Naruto turned his gaze away, his mind still clouded by the weight of his choices. He knew that this moment, this encounter, would change nothing. He was still the Phoenix King, still the ruler of all. But for the first time in a long time, he didn't feel entirely alone. Follow me, he said, his voice cold again, though tinged with something else. And I will make you my consort. You will serve me as all the others do. Hinata nodded, though her heart ached at the thought. She knew what he was asking, but she also knew that this was her chance to reach him, to help him see the person he could still be. Naruto, the Phoenix King, had spared her. And with that, a new chapter began, one that would either burn him down completely or lift him from the ashes. Only time would tell. Naruto stood at the summit of his new empire, looking out across the scorched remains of the territories he had claimed. The sky was an eerie shade of crimson, as if the heavens themselves had been stained by the infernos he had unleashed. Below, his followers, his loyalists, the ones who bore the marks of his flames, prepared for what was to come. This was a time of reckoning, a time of power, a time when Naruto's rule would extend beyond what any mortal could comprehend. The Phoenix King had never been content with just ruling the scattered remnants of his former world. No, he was beyond that now. He was something greater, something that no one could challenge or threaten. His flames had burned away any pretenses of humility, leaving behind an unshakable certainty. His immortality, his power, was now the foundation of his empire. Naruto's ambitions had grown far beyond the borders of the elemental nations. He had begun to create an army of creatures forged in the heart of his flames, each one a reflection of his will, an extension of his godlike strength. These were no mere soldiers, they were weapons, living embodiments of the Phoenix King's power. With every burnished scar, every mark of flame upon their skin, they were bound to him, bound to his will. His army would be unstoppable, an extension of his divine retribution, and all who opposed him would be crushed beneath the weight of his fury. But Naruto was not blind to the fact that there were still those who would dare to challenge him. Even now, the whispers of insurrection, the desperate attempts to undermine his reign, echoed in the darker corners of his empire. One such whisper was that of Orochimaru, the legendary rogue ninja who had once sought to master immortality through forbidden jutsu. Orochimaru, foolish enough to believe he could seize Naruto's power for himself, had begun to plot in the shadows. Naruto had long been aware of the snake's schemes. He had known that Orochimaru, ever hungry for power, would eventually turn his eyes toward the Phoenix King. What Orochimaru did not understand, however, was that there was no way to steal what was not given. Naruto had transcended the need for mortal limitations, and Orochimaru's greed would be his undoing. It was not long before the confrontation came. Orochimaru, with his vast knowledge of forbidden jutsu and his unrelenting desire for power, had tracked Naruto down to one of his hidden sanctuaries. The place was cloaked in a dense fog of chakra, the air thick with the heat of the surrounding flames that constantly burned in a circle around the fortress. The heat was suffocating, but Orochimaru was undeterred. He believed he had found a way to defeat Naruto, a technique that could sever the bond between Naruto and the flames that fueled him. It was a last-ditch effort to take control of the Phoenix King's powers and claim them for himself. Orochimaru entered the sanctuary, his serpentine form slithering through the shadowed halls. His movements were deliberate, almost predatory, as he sought his prey. But Naruto was no mere prey. He was a god, and Orochimaru had made the fatal mistake of thinking otherwise. Naruto stood in the heart of the sanctuary, surrounded by the brilliant, unyielding flames that were his trademark. His figure was illuminated in the fire's glow, casting long shadows against the walls. The flames, so hot that they shimmered in the air, were extensions of his will, moving at his command, alive with his fury. You've come, Naruto said, his voice low, the words vibrating with a power that made the air itself tremble. Orochimaru's lips twisted into a mocking grin, his long, sharp tongue flicking out in amusement. I've come to claim what is rightfully mine, he hissed, his voice dripping with arrogance. Your power, your immortality, it belongs to me. And now, I will take it? Naruto's eyes narrowed, a cold, burning anger flaring within him. You think you can take what I have earned? His voice was a growl now, full of venom. You're a fool, Orochimaru. The snake sage sneered, his fingers forming seals as he prepared to unleash his forbidden jutsu. But Naruto was quicker. In the blink of an eye, a wave of fire erupted from his body, consuming the space between them. The flames tore through the air like living creatures, their heat so intense that the very ground seemed to crack and buckle beneath their touch. Orochimaru's jutsu was interrupted by the blinding inferno. He recoiled, his eyes widening in shock as he realized the extent of Naruto's power. What is this? He gasped, struggling to move through the searing heat. Naruto's flames surged forward, engulfing Orochimaru in an all-consuming blaze. Orochimaru screamed in agony as the fire burned through his body, his flesh withering away under the assault. The Phoenix King stood unmoved, watching as the once proud rogue ninja was reduced to ash and bone. The flames were his judgment, and no one, not even Orochimaru, could escape their wrath. When the flames subsided, there was nothing left of Orochimaru. No trace of his once mighty form remained, only a faint smell of charred flesh hanging in the air. Naruto stood tall, his eyes still burning with the intensity of the flames that had consumed his enemy. He was unscathed, his body untouched by the fire he had summoned. Orochimaru's ambition was his undoing, Naruto muttered to himself, his voice barely audible above the crackling embers. He was too weak to understand true power. The fire around him dimmed, as if in response to his words, settling into a gentle warmth. It was a strange, unsettling calm. But for Naruto, it was a moment of clarity. Orochimaru had been one of the last threats to his reign, and now, with the snake's death, there was nothing left to challenge him. His dominance was unassailable, and no one would dare oppose him again. He turned away from the smoldering remains of his foe, walking toward the heart of his fortress. His mind was consumed with thoughts of what came next. The world was his, but he desired more. He desired absolute control, not just over land, but over the very souls of the people who inhabited it. It was time to make his intentions clear. Naruto ascended to his throne, the seat of power he had claimed with his flames. He raised a hand, and the flames around him responded, twisting and swirling in intricate patterns. They burned with the intensity of 1,000 suns, and as they danced, Naruto spoke. I am a god, he declared, his voice booming, filling the room and spilling out into the world beyond. And as a god, I demand worship. I demand sacrifices. You will bow to me, for I am the Phoenix King, the eternal flame that will consume all who stand in my way. The words echoed through the corridors of his fortress, reaching the ears of his followers, those who had sworn fealty to him and those who feared his wrath. The flame that was his power had become his symbol, a mark of his divinity. No longer would there be mercy for the weak, for those who cowered in the shadows. Every soul in his empire would be subject to his will. The flames surged higher, illuminating the dark corners of the world, casting a red glow across the land. The Phoenix King was reborn, and the world would burn with him. His people, those who had pledged their loyalty, gathered before him. They knelt in unison, their faces bowed in reverence, their eyes filled with a mixture of awe and fear. For they knew that Naruto was no longer the boy they had once known. He was a god, a force of nature that could not be stopped. And they, too, were bound to him, marked by his fire. Naruto looked down upon them, his gaze cold and calculating. He could see the fear in their eyes, the fear of the unknown, the fear of the power he now wielded. But there was something else, too. There was a hunger in their hearts, a hunger for more, for power, for a place at his side. They had come to worship him, to serve him, to offer themselves as sacrifices to the Phoenix King. And you, Naruto said, his voice low and dangerous, will give me your lives, your loyalty. You will burn with me, or you will be consumed. He extended his hand, and the flames around him intensified, reaching toward the kneeling masses. They bowed even lower, trembling before him, as the flames danced in the air like living creatures, their heat palpable. I am the Phoenix King, Naruto whispered, his voice barely a breath, and I will reign over this world forever. The flames rose higher, consuming everything in their path, and the world trembled beneath the weight of his power. The Phoenix King had spoken, and the world would never be the same. The air over Konoha was thick with tension. The once vibrant village now lay under the oppressive shadow of its new ruler. Naruto, once a child of dreams and ambitions, now stood as the embodiment of destruction and control. His flame-wrought power had crushed all opposition, and his rule over the village was absolute. But even the strongest walls have cracks, and in the heart of the Broken Leaf village, whispers of rebellion began to stir. Konoha was not the village it once was. The great Hokage monument, once a symbol of hope and unity, now stood as a grim reminder of the past. The faces carved into the rock, each representing the legacy of the Hokages, were now obscured by the flames that had consumed the village. Their proud expressions seemed almost mocking, as if daring anyone to oppose the Phoenix King. The rebellion, though small, was swift in its formation. Among those leading the charge were some of Konoha's most respected former ninjas, people who had once believed in the village's ideals and principles. At the helm of this resistance was none other than Kakashi Hatake, the former copy ninja. His reputation as a strategist and skilled fighter made him a natural leader. Alongside him stood Tsunade, the former Hokage, who had once guided the village with wisdom and strength. Kakashi had long been haunted by the loss of his comrades, but seeing Naruto's transformation into a tyrant, a god who crushed the very ideals Konoha had stood for, broke something deep inside him. Tsunade, too, was filled with grief for her village, for her friends, and for Naruto, who had become a monster beyond recognition. The rebellion was born out of desperation, a last-ditch effort to reclaim what Konoha had lost. The former ninjas knew they stood no chance against Naruto's flames, but they could not bear to remain silent any longer. They had to try, even if it meant dying in vain. They planned carefully, gathering allies from within the village and the surrounding areas, hoping to strike at the heart of Naruto's empire. But Naruto was not a god to be caught off guard. He knew of their plans before they even had a chance to make their move. His spies, his loyal soldiers, had infiltrated every corner of the village. He had eyes everywhere. His flames could see through the shadows, and he had become as much a part of the village as the land itself. The rebellion began one cold night. A small group of former ninjas, led by Kakashi and Tsunade, launched their attack on the heart of the village, hoping to disrupt Naruto's stronghold and force him into a confrontation. They moved under the cover of darkness, their movements swift and calculated. But even as they made their way through the village, they could feel the suffocating presence of Naruto's power. It was in the air, a palpable force that made every step they took feel heavier, more dangerous. They reached the Hokage building, the symbol of their once great village, now twisted by Naruto's corruption. The doors were locked, but Tsunade's strength shattered them with ease. Inside, the former Hokage's office stood as it always had, save for the ominous presence of Naruto's mark, which hung in the air like a dark cloud. But before they could gather their thoughts, the flames erupted. Naruto appeared before them, his presence as commanding as ever. The flames that had once been a tool of his power now surged around him like an extension of his very being. His eyes glowed with an otherworldly light, and the heat in the air was unbearable. Kakashi, despite his calm demeanor, could feel the sweat bead on his forehead. He had never imagined it would come to this, fighting the very child he had once trained, the boy who had once been his comrade. Did you really think you could take back what you lost? Naruto's voice was calm, almost mocking. This village is mine now, and it will always be mine. You are nothing more than insects in my flame. Tsunade stood tall, her fists clenched. Naruto, she said, her voice cracking with emotion. This isn't you. This isn't the boy we raised. You're a monster. Naruto's expression twisted with disdain. I'm not the boy you raised. I'm something far greater than that now. He spread his arms, and the flames surged, illuminating the room in a hellish glow. I am the Phoenix King, and you are nothing. The rebellion was over before it even began. Kakashi moved first, his Sharingan blazing as he activated his most powerful techniques, hoping to find a way to strike Naruto down. But it was futile. No matter how fast he moved, no matter how many jutsu he threw, Naruto's flames consumed everything in their path. Kakashi's attacks were little more than sparks against the inferno. With a simple flick of his hand, Naruto sent Kakashi crashing into the wall, his body burning with the heat of the flames that had surrounded him. Kakashi, Tsunade gasped, rushing to her fallen comrade. But before she could reach him, Naruto appeared before her, his hand raised in a gesture that could only mean one thing. You dare challenge me? Naruto's voice was cold, devoid of emotion. You are nothing. You are all nothing. Tsunade tried to gather her strength, but it was futile. She was no match for Naruto's power, no matter how much of a fight she had left in her. The flames of his fury licked at the edges of her vision, and she knew, deep in her heart, that there was no escape. Kakashi was already beyond saving, his body scorched and broken beyond recognition. Please, Tsunade begged, her voice breaking. Spare him. Spare the village. I will do anything, just please. Naruto's eyes narrowed, and for a moment, there was a flicker of something, perhaps a memory of the boy she had once known. But it was gone in an instant. He raised his hand, and the flames surged toward Kakashi's broken body, engulfing it in an inferno so intense that nothing remained. The sound of the flames was deafening, the crackling and hissing filling the room as Tsunade watched in horror. The body of her former comrade was consumed entirely, leaving nothing but ash. The ashes floated into the air, carried by the heat of Naruto's flames. Tsunade fell to her knees, her heart breaking at the sight. Kakashi was gone, and so was the last semblance of the Konoha she had once known. Now, Tsunade, Naruto said, his voice icy. You can either kneel before me and serve as my advisor, or you can join your precious friend in the flames. Tsunade's heart twisted. She had never imagined this would be her fate. But she knew what Naruto was capable of. She had seen it with her own eyes. The boy she had once loved as a son was no more. In his place was a tyrant, a god, who would burn anything and anyone who stood in his way. With tears in her eyes, Tsunade bowed her head. I will serve you, she whispered, her voice barely audible. But you've broken us, Naruto. You've broken everything we fought for. Naruto didn't respond. He merely turned, his back to her, and the flames rose higher, casting their sickly glow across the broken remnants of Konoha. Tsunade was left with nothing but the ruins of a village, the ashes of her comrades, and the knowledge that there was no going back. The rebellion was over. And Naruto's reign was solidified. The flames of his conquest had burned away all who had opposed him, and there would be no one left to challenge his rule. He was the Phoenix King, the eternal ruler of a world that had bowed to him. And nothing would stand in his way again. The sun hung low over the horizon, casting a blood-red hue across the sky. The earth trembled beneath the weight of an impending war. Word of Naruto's dominance had spread like wildfire, reaching the ears of every village in the elemental nations. His grip on Konoha was absolute, and his power, an unyielding inferno, had consumed anyone foolish enough to challenge him. However, not all were willing to submit. A coalition of the remaining villages Tsunagakuer, Kirigakuer, Iwagakuer, and Kilmagakuer had banded together, driven by a singular purpose, to take down the Phoenix King and free the world from his reign of terror. Their leaders, wise and battle-hardened, knew that this would be their last chance. To fight against the godlike being that Naruto had become, they needed to pool their strength, draw upon their most powerful shinobi, and prepare for an all-out war. The strategy was simple: strike at the heart of his empire, force him into battle, and use every resource at their disposal to overwhelm him. They knew they would lose many lives, but if they could kill Naruto, they would save the world. It was a risk they had to take. In the dead of night, the armies of the four great villages gathered at the borders of Naruto's conquered lands, a sprawling battlefield stretching as far as the eye could see. The coalition's leaders stood together at the forefront of their combined forces, their faces grim and resolute. They understood the enormity of the battle ahead, and they knew they had no hope of winning without a decisive blow against the Phoenix King. Among them were the likes of Gaara, the fifth kazekage, whose immense power and will to protect his people had earned him great respect. There was Mai Terumi, the fifth Mizukage, known for her beauty as much as her strength. Unaki, the third Sechikage, whose experience in battle was unmatched, and the fourth Raikage, whose lightning-fast strikes and brutal strength were feared across the world. Together, they had formulated a strategy to take down the tyrant. The time for planning had passed. As dawn broke, Naruto's spies reported that the coalition had gathered. He stood alone on the peak of a mountain, watching the distant armies amass. His crimson eyes glowed like embers, and the air around him crackled with the raw power of his flames. He knew the war was coming. He had known it since the moment they decided to challenge him. But Naruto had long since surpassed the limits of mere mortals. The flames that flowed through his veins had turned him into an immortal being, a god who could not be slain. His body had become a furnace of destruction, and the very air he breathed carried the scent of death. The forces gathering against him were nothing more than a futile resistance, like insects trying to extinguish the sun. With a single thought, Naruto summoned the flames, letting them wash over him like a cloak. His form ignited, and his presence filled the battlefield with the promise of annihilation. The wind carried the scent of burning as he descended upon the coalition. As the coalition forces moved forward, a wave of dread swept over them. The ground beneath their feet seemed to shift and crack, and the sky itself seemed to darken. The leaders of the villages looked to the horizon, and there, rising from the ash and smoke, was the figure of Naruto. His flames billowed around him, casting a fiery glow across the land. "Gather your strength," Unaki called out, his voice booming across the assembled army. "Today, we fight for the future of our world. We fight for our people." But his words were drowned by the roar of Naruto's flames, which exploded outward in a wave of heat that sent shockwaves through the ranks. The soldiers, trained in the art of war, braced themselves. But no amount of preparation could shield them from the overwhelming power that Naruto wielded. The battle began with a sudden burst of fire. Naruto landed in the midst of the coalition army, his flames swirling around him like a living entity. His eyes glowed with an eerie red light as he raised his hand, unleashing a torrent of fire that consumed everything in its path. The ground cracked and burned beneath him, turning to ash and smoke. The soldiers screamed as they were incinerated by the searing heat. In the chaos, the coalition leaders rallied their forces, each determined to play their part. Mai Terumi summoned her water release jutsu, creating a massive wave of water to try and douse the flames. But it was useless. The fire that surrounded Naruto was not something that could be extinguished by mere water. It was a force of nature, an embodiment of his eternal flame. The Raikage charged forward, his body crackling with lightning. His fists, charged with the power of the Raiden, struck at Naruto with incredible speed, hoping to land a blow. But Naruto was faster. With a single swipe of his hand, He sent a wave of fire crashing into sending the wreckage flying backward. His body scorched, his clothes torn, struggled to rise, his eyes filled with rage and defiance. You think you can challenge me? Naruto's voice was a deep growl, his flames flickering around him like a living beast. He stepped forward, his presence like an overwhelming storm, his gaze fixed on the leaders of the coalition. You are nothing but insects, crawling in the dirt. Gaara, the kazekage, stepped forward, his sand swirling around him like a protective shield. He had learned much since Naruto's rise, and his power was great, but even he could feel the weight of Naruto's flames. We will stop you, Gaara said, his voice steady. The world will not bend to your will. Naruto's response was swift. With a wave of his hand, he unleashed a torrent of flames, twisting the air with the sheer intensity of his power. Gaara raised his sand in defense, but it was no match for the inferno that washed over him. His body was scorched, the sand turning to glass as it melted away. Gaara gritted his teeth, pushing himself to stand, but the damage was done. He could no longer continue the fight. The other leaders watched in horror as their forces were decimated by the Phoenix King. His flames tore through their ranks, burning them alive in an instant. His power was unstoppable, a force of nature that consumed everything in its path. The battlefield, once teeming with the sounds of war, was now silent except for the crackling of the flames. As the leaders realized the futility of their struggle, they retreated. Their armies were shattered, their spirits broken. Only a handful of survivors remained, scattered across the field, their bodies burned and broken. The rest of the coalition had been reduced to ash, their lives snuffed out by the Phoenix King's wrath. Naruto stood atop the ashes of the battlefield, his flames swirling around him like an eternal crown. He surveyed the carnage, his heart cold and unyielding. The elemental nations are mine, he declared, his voice carrying across the scorched earth. There is no more resistance. There is only me. The survivors, those who had fled, had no choice but to kneel before him. Their will had been broken. The power of Naruto was absolute, and they knew that to resist any longer would be to sign their own death warrants. The villages, once proud and independent, were now united under one banner, Naruto's. He had burned away their resistance, crushed their hopes, and left them with nothing but the knowledge that they were his subjects, bound to his will. The Phoenix King had risen, and the world would bow to him. In the aftermath of the battle, Naruto's flames continued to burn, a reminder to all that resistance was futile. The immortal ruler had claimed victory, and nothing would stand in his way. The war was over, and the elemental nations were his domain. The dust had barely settled from Naruto's conquest of the elemental nations. The once proud villages now lay in ruins, their defenses shattered, their citizens either crushed underfoot or forced into submission. The world had been reshaped in his image, and his iron-fisted rule spread far and wide. Yet as Naruto stood at the pinnacle of his power, surrounded by his endless flames and the charred remnants of his enemies, a darker side of his nature began to surface. He had always been ruthless, but now, something inside him stirred an insatiable desire, not just for power, but for dominance in every form. He had burned away the resistance, annihilated entire villages, but now, his focus shifted. His flames no longer sought merely to destroy. They sought to consume everything: control, submission, and, above all, pleasure. The women of the conquered villages were the first to feel the weight of his newfound lust for control. He gathered them, one by one, from the villages he had raised. Beautiful women, strong women, broken women, each one was taken, forced to bow to him, to serve him in whatever capacity he demanded. Hinata, once the gentle and kind-hearted girl he had known, had become a mere tool in his growing collection. She had been spared, not out of mercy, but as a symbol of his power over her, his ultimate control over her loyalty. Naruto's harem grew, an ever-expanding collection of women from every village he had conquered. From the defeated inhabitants of Konoha, to the once proud kunoichi of the sand, water, and cloud villages, they were all drawn into his web, all subject to his whims. They were his trophies, his symbols of absolute dominion over the world. He took them not out of love, but out of a twisted sense of possession, a need to own everything around him. Hinata's once gentle heart, which had always harbored affection for Naruto, now twisted with confusion and fear. She watched as he grew darker, his cruelty and lust for control reaching terrifying heights. She had once dreamed of a life with him, a life filled with hope and love. But now, as she lay in his presence, trembling under his cold, domineering gaze, she realized that the Naruto she had once admired was no longer the same. His warmth had been replaced by a cold, calculating ruthlessness. The fire that burned within him now consumed not just his enemies, but everything around him. As the days passed, Hinata's once unshakable loyalty began to fracture. She questioned the decisions she had made, the path she had chosen. But the fear of defying him, of facing the wrath of his flames, kept her bound to him. There was no escape. If she tried to leave, if she even thought about escaping, she would be burned alive. His flames had proven that to her time and time again. So, she stayed. Silent. Submissive. Naruto, sensing the change in her, became more possessive. He enjoyed the power he held over her, the way she would flinch under his gaze, the way she obeyed him without question. But the cracks in her devotion were becoming more apparent. Her once adoring eyes no longer looked at him with the same warmth, the same love. Now, they held a flicker of fear, of doubt. He would not allow that to continue. The Phoenix King had no room for weakness, no room for those who questioned him. One night, as Hinata stood by his side, her gaze distant, her mind lost in thoughts of rebellion and escape, Naruto's patience snapped. His eyes burned with an intensity that sent a chill down her spine. He grabbed her by the arm, pulling her close to him, his voice a low, dangerous growl. "You dare to doubt me?" His hand tightened around her wrist, his grip like iron. "I've given you everything. I've spared you, made you mine, and you repay me with this." Hinata trembled, but she didn't dare to speak. She feared what he might do if she did. Her heart beat in her chest like a trapped bird, desperate for freedom, but knowing it was impossible. Naruto's eyes narrowed, his voice cold and commanding. "If you want to leave, if you want to defy me, you know what will happen." His hand shot forward, flames licking the air as he gripped her throat, his fire coursing around her skin, but never touching her, just close enough to make her feel its heat, its power. Tears welled up in Hinata's eyes, but she remained silent. She had learned long ago that speaking against Naruto would only bring destruction. She had seen him burn entire villages to the ground, watched him obliterate his enemies with a mere thought. And now, she was no different. She had become a prisoner in her own heart, a prisoner to his desires. Naruto released his grip on her throat, but his flames continued to smolder around her, just barely contained. He studied her for a long moment, his eyes piercing into her soul. "You belong to me, Hinata," he said, his voice soft yet terrifying. "Your love, your loyalty, everything about you is mine. You have no choice but to obey." Hinata closed her eyes, unable to speak, unable to fight back. Deep down, she knew the truth. She was nothing to him anymore. Just another possession, another tool to be used at his whim. But as much as she hated herself for it, as much as she longed for the warmth of her old life, she couldn't escape. Naruto was no longer the boy she had once admired. He was a king, a tyrant, a god. And there was no place for her in his world but as his servant, his concubine. His flames consumed everything around him, and now, they consumed her too. Naruto's cruelty did not stop with Hinata. It spread to every corner of his empire. His desires knew no bounds, and his thirst for control extended to every woman he took under his command. He forced his harem to submit to his every whim, to fulfill his every desire, and those who resisted were punished severely. His flames were always present, a reminder of his power, of the consequences of defying him. His followers began to fear him. Even those who had once worshipped him, who had followed him into battle, began to question their loyalty. They saw the darkness in his eyes, the way he toyed with people, breaking them down to build himself up. His power was unmatched, but his cruelty was something else entirely. The people who had once believed in him now feared the very flames that had once symbolized hope. In the depths of his heart, Naruto knew that he had become something monstrous. But that knowledge only fueled his desire. He was a god now, and gods did not care for the frailties of mortal emotions. They only took what they wanted and destroyed what stood in their way. And what he wanted now was everything. The world trembled beneath his flames. His reign would continue, and no one would be able to stop him. No one would dare to defy him. Not even the woman who once loved him. The moon hung low in the sky, casting a dim glow over the barren landscape that had once been the heart of the elemental nations. Now, it was little more than a wasteland, burned villages, shattered temples, and the charred remnants of a world that had once thrived under its own fragile peace. Naruto stood at the center of it all, his ever-present flames flickering and dancing with an intensity that seemed to mirror the darkness festering inside him. The Phoenix King had conquered all, or so he thought. Whispers had reached his ears, fleeting rumors carried by the wind. There were those who still dared to resist him, rogue shinobi, former allies, and even some who had once served him in his early days of conquest. They had plotted his downfall, seeing in his growing tyranny the potential for their own power. But Naruto would not allow such treachery. He would not tolerate anyone questioning his reign, especially not in the shadows. The night he learned of their plot, the flames inside him grew colder, darker. His once bright inferno, the symbol of his unstoppable rise, now flickered with an ominous hue. His eyes, once filled with passion, were now like pools of molten lava, empty of any mercy, cold with the promise of destruction. The thought of betrayal sent a shiver down his spine, igniting a fire that burned even hotter. He had taken the world by force, reshaped it in his image, and now, these insects had the audacity to defy him. Naruto's fury could not be contained. It swelled inside him like a volcano waiting to erupt. The weight of his power, the scope of his flames, was more than enough to annihilate those who dared to challenge him. He had known power in every form, physical, emotional, and now, divine. His flames were the most terrifying force in the world, and nothing, no one, would survive his wrath. He set out alone, his presence a harbinger of death. His former comrades, his allies, his enemies, they would all be consumed by his fire. There was no place in this world for anyone who stood against him. No room for rebellion, no mercy for betrayal. Naruto tracked the rogue shinobi to a hidden cave nestled deep in the mountains, far away from the reach of the villages he had burned. It was there they had gathered, planning his assassination, convinced that his reign was a fragile thing, that they could end it all in one swift stroke. As Naruto approached, his eyes narrowed. The flickering glow of his flames illuminated the darkened cave mouth, casting eerie shadows on the jagged rocks. His senses were heightened, his every movement deliberate. He could feel their presence, his enemies huddled inside, unaware that their lives would soon be snuffed out. He stepped into the cave, his flame-infused chakra radiating around him like a heat wave. The rogue shinobi froze at the sight of him, their faces draining of color as the realization struck them. They had underestimated him. They thought themselves clever, but Naruto was far beyond their reach now. He was a force of nature, an unstoppable tide that would wash away anything standing in his way. Did you think you could hide from me? Naruto's voice echoed through the cave, carrying with it the weight of his rage. His presence alone was enough to make the walls tremble, his aura radiating an unspoken threat. You've made a grave mistake. The first rogue shinobi stepped forward, desperate. Naruto, Please listen. We don't want to fight you. We were just. Shut up, Naruto snarled, his voice like the crackling of a fire. You dare to plot against me, to strike at me behind my back, and you expect mercy. His hand moved with blinding speed, and in an instant, a torrent of flames surged forward, engulfing the rogue shinobi. The man screamed in agony as the fire consumed him, his body reduced to ash within seconds. The others shrank back, their faces pale with terror as they realized what they were up against. But Naruto was not done. His flames only grew stronger, more intense, more lethal. They burned with a cold, unyielding ferocity, the heat radiating from him like the very heart of the sun. He moved through the cave like a shadow, his movements fluid and precise. His enemies had nowhere to run, no place to hide. One by one, they fell. The rogue shinobi tried to fight back, but it was hopeless. Their jutsu, their skills, their weapons, they were nothing before Naruto's flames. His regeneration made him nearly invincible. He could heal from any wound, recover from any blow, and his flames burned brighter with every life he took. The cave became a furnace, a hellish landscape where screams echoed off the walls, swallowed by the roar of the fire. The final moments of the last shinobi were met with Naruto's cold gaze. The man trembled, his hands raised in a desperate plea. Please, spare me. I didn't know it would come to this. We only wanted to stop you, but... Enough, Naruto said, his voice deadened with finality. You all should have known better. With a wave of his hand, the flames surged forward again, and the last rogue shinobi was incinerated in an instant, his body vanishing into nothingness. The cave was silent, save for the crackling of the embers and the faint scent of charred flesh. Naruto stood in the center of the ruins, his chest heaving with a mixture of exertion and satisfaction. The heat of the flames still lingered around him, and the walls of the cave had melted into an unrecognizable mess of stone. The rogue shinobi were no more, their plans erased in the blink of an eye. But as the last echoes of their screams faded, something darker stirred within Naruto. The flames that had once symbolized his rise to power, his unyielding strength, had taken on a new meaning. They were no longer just a tool for domination, they were a symbol of his madness. The fire that burned within him was not just the fire of a conqueror. It was the fire of a god whose thirst for control had no limits, no end. His thoughts turned to Hinata, to the others he had taken into his harem. They had all been swept into his world, forced to kneel at his feet. But now, he wondered, was he still the Naruto they had known? Or had he become something else entirely? His flames had consumed so much, destroyed so much, that he wasn't sure anymore. His vision had narrowed, his desires growing more twisted with every passing day. He sought power not just for the sake of ruling but for the sake of destruction itself. As Naruto turned and left the cave, his flames smoldering behind him, the darkness that had taken root in his heart spread further. He was no longer just a man. He was something much greater, much more terrifying, a creature of flame and fury, an unstoppable force destined to burn the world to ash. And with each passing moment, that fire grew stronger, its hunger ever deepening. The world that Naruto had crafted was one of fire, one where nothing stood in his way, nothing dared defy him. His flames, the manifestation of his will, had turned cities into cinders and countries into ash. He was unstoppable, a king whose reign stretched across every corner of the elemental nations. His immortality, his flames, his unyielding power, there was no one left to challenge him. Naruto stood at the peak of his throne, a towering spire of blackened stone and iron, his darkened chakra rising like a storm over the land. His flames, once bright and pure, now burned cold and unrelenting. The Phoenix King had ascended, and the world lay beneath his foot. His eyes, once warm with the spirit of adventure, once full of dreams of recognition, were now cold, the color of molten lava, burning with a desire for absolute control. He had destroyed those who opposed him, reshaped the villages, and forged alliances with the broken remnants of the Akatsuki. The elemental nations were his to command, and those who were not loyal were merely cinders in the wind. But as Naruto stood over his kingdom, surveying the ruins of the world he had remade, something stirred within him, a cold, uncomfortable sensation. For all the power he wielded, for all the destruction he had caused, he found no solace. His flames, once a symbol of hope, were now a symbol of his endless hunger. He felt the weight of his own emptiness, the silence of an unchallenged throne. Yet, even as he brooded, his mind remained sharp. There were no more true challengers left, none who could match his power. His chains of flame were unbreakable, binding anyone foolish enough to oppose him. He had tested them on countless warriors, once proud shinobi, now mere slaves to his will. With a flick of his hand, Naruto summoned the chains, blazing links of fire that twisted and coiled in the air like serpents. These chains were not mere tools, but the embodiment of his dominance. His will was absolute, and those who defied him found themselves bound in eternal servitude, their bodies helpless against the raw power he controlled. The chains were indestructible, capable of holding even the most powerful shinobi, those who once stood proudly as cages, now humbled by his overwhelming might. He had bound Tsunade, the last of the legendary Sunin, to his will. He had chained Kakashi, forced him to his knees, broken the spirit of every resistance leader who dared to oppose him. The Akatsuki had fallen to his flames, and even the likes of Itachi, who once wore the mantle of darkness with pride, now served at his side. In his world, there was no resistance. But in the depths of his empire, cracks were beginning to form. Whispers. Rumors. Some spoke of rebellion, of resistance stirring once again in the shadows. They were the remnants of old ideals, those who refused to bend to Naruto's vision. He had extinguished their flames once before, but the embers remained, smoldering in the corners of his vast empire. Naruto could feel it, though he chose to ignore it. His flames still consumed the world, but something had changed. The whispers grew louder, the tension thicker in the air. For the first time in years, he felt a flicker of doubt. Was his reign as unshakable as he thought? Could there truly be those who still sought to defy him? One night, as he stood alone atop his obsidian throne, his mind weighed heavy with these thoughts, a messenger arrived. His face was pale, his breath quick with fear, yet there was a sense of urgency in his voice that Naruto could not ignore. "Lord Naruto, there are movements, rumors of rebellion," the messenger gasped, his eyes darting nervously around the chamber. Naruto turned his gaze to the messenger, his fiery aura intensifying. "Explain yourself," he demanded, his voice deep and resonant, like the rumble of a volcano about to erupt. The messenger swallowed hard, his throat dry with fear. "There are whispers among the people, those who once served you, some of your generals, even a few within the villages you conquered. They speak of an uprising, a resistance forming in secret. They believe your rule has become tyrannical, that your fire has burned too hot for too long. Some are planning to strike against you." A cold silence filled the room, broken only by the faint crackling of Naruto's flames. His hands tightened into fists, and his eyes glowed brighter with an unsettling intensity. He had heard these whispers before, but this time, they felt real. This time, they were not just empty threats or the chatter of the weak. This time, the people were truly starting to question him. Naruto's flame surged with anger, his aura growing darker. He had crushed every opponent, silenced every rebellion with the full force of his fire, and yet now, a shadow of doubt had begun to creep into his empire. The fear he had instilled in others, the terror that had once ensured his dominance, was no longer enough to keep the silence at bay. He rose from his throne, his chains of flame wrapping around his arms like serpents ready to strike. His heart pounded in his chest, a mixture of anger and frustration flooding his veins. He had never truly considered that rebellion could rise against him, not after everything he had done. But now, the seeds had been planted, and they were growing. He moved toward the messenger, his fiery gaze never leaving the man's trembling form. "Who leads this rebellion?" he demanded, his voice a low growl. The messenger flinched, his words stammering out. I don't know, my lord. They are careful. The resistance is fractured, and no one knows their leader." Naruto's eyes narrowed, the flames around him flickering in response to his rising fury. He had given everything for this empire, and now these whispers threatened to tear it all down. His flames, once the symbol of his power, now burned with the fury of a wounded god. "Find them," Naruto commanded, his voice cold and resolute. "Find their leader, and bring them to me. I will burn them from this world. I will ensure that no one dares defy me again." The messenger nodded quickly, then bolted from the chamber, eager to escape the wrath of the Phoenix King. Naruto watched him go, his thoughts darkening even further. This rebellion, these whispers had to be eradicated before they could grow into something more. He had not come this far to be brought down by the very people he had once sworn to protect. His flames would burn brighter than ever, and anyone who dared to question his rule would find themselves consumed. But in the back of his mind, as his flames flickered and danced around him, Naruto couldn't help but wonder, had he truly become the monster they saw him as? Had his lust for control blinded him to everything else? The thought gnawed at him, but he quickly shoved it away. There was no place for weakness in this world. There was only power, only flames. The rebellion would fall, and Naruto would rise higher than ever before. His chains would bind the world, and no one would escape his grasp. The world had grown cold beneath Naruto's reign, a place where resistance had all but died, where rebellion was nothing more than a fleeting dream. His flames had consumed everything, the villages, the hidden shinobi, the will of the people. There was no hope for the weak, no mercy for those who dared defy him. In his eyes, they were nothing but embers, scattered across a land of ash. But even in the darkest of times, there are those who refuse to bow, those who hold onto their beliefs despite the weight of the world pressing down on them. From the depths of Naruto's empire, a coalition of survivors had risen, those who had once fought alongside him, those who had seen his rise and remembered the man he used to be. They had come together, determined to end the tyrant's reign once and for all. Among them were Sasuke, his once closest friend and rival, Karin, whose ties to the Uzumaki bloodline made her both a target and an ally, and a handful of others who had managed to escape Naruto's fiery grasp. Their plan was simple but dangerous: they would challenge Naruto directly. They knew it was a long shot, a battle they could never win. But they fought for something greater than survival, they fought for the freedom of the world. As they made their way toward the heart of Naruto's empire, a heavy sense of dread hung in the air. The land itself seemed to recoil from Naruto's presence, the very earth scorched by the heat of his flames. But still, they pressed on, driven by the faintest flicker of hope that they could break the chains that bound the world to Naruto's rule. Sasuke, now a shadow of the man he once was, looked around at the group. He could see the fear in their eyes, the uncertainty in their hearts. They were no match for Naruto, not in terms of power. But they had something more, something Naruto had long forgotten: the will to fight for what was right, even if it meant facing certain death. The rebellion had started small, but word of their movement had spread like wildfire. It was only a matter of time before Naruto became aware of their existence. And he did. It didn't take long for his spies to catch wind of their plan. The Phoenix King was never caught off guard. He had eyes and ears everywhere, his flames reaching into every corner of the world. Naruto knew they were coming. And yet, he had allowed them to reach this point. The final confrontation was inevitable. The group made their way to the heart of Naruto's domain, where the Phoenix King awaited them. His throne stood high above them, a symbol of his unassailable power. The air crackled with energy as Naruto stood atop his obsidian spire, the flames around him flickering like living creatures. His eyes, glowing with an unnatural heat, turned toward the approaching rebellion. "You've come," Naruto's voice echoed across the battlefield, a deep, resonant sound that vibrated in their bones. "Did you truly believe you could overthrow me? After everything I've done, everything I've sacrificed? You are nothing. You always have been." Sasuke stood at the front, his Sharingan blazing with determination. He had not forgotten the pain of their past, nor the betrayal that had shaped him. But the man before him was no longer his friend. He was a god, a being whose power surpassed comprehension. And yet, Sasuke could not let go of the remnants of the bond they once shared. He could not let Naruto's reign continue, no matter the cost. "We've come to end this," Sasuke declared, his voice steady despite the dread threatening to overtake him. "You've gone too far, Naruto. You've burned everything, everyone. There's nothing left for you to conquer. It's over." Naruto's laughter was low, guttural, as if the very sound came from the depths of his soul. "Over? It will never be over. This world is mine, Sasuke. It always has been. You cannot defeat me. I am beyond you. I am beyond all of you." The battle began in a flash, a violent explosion of chakra and flame. Sasuke rushed forward, lightning fast, his sword crackling with power as he aimed for Naruto's heart. But Naruto was already moving, his flames shifting like liquid, dodging and retaliating with ruthless precision. The heat of the flames distorted the air, making it impossible to track his movements. Sasuke's eyes narrowed as he summoned his own flames, his Amaterasu flames lashing out at Naruto. But the Phoenix King was unfazed. He twisted his body, his flames rising in defense, consuming the black fire in seconds. Sasuke's expression faltered. He had known it wouldn't be easy, but he hadn't expected the sheer magnitude of Naruto's power. He had faced this man before, but this was a different being entirely. Karen, ever the strategist, tried to assist, using her chakra to heal Sasuke's wounds and provide support from the sidelines. But Naruto's presence was overwhelming, his flames making it difficult for her to concentrate. Every step they took felt like they were walking into the heart of a wildfire, the very ground beneath them scorching with every movement. Despite their efforts, they were powerless. Naruto had grown stronger since their last encounter. His flames had evolved, taking on an almost sentient form. They burned with a cold, calculating intelligence, as if the very fire itself had become an extension of his will. There was no escape from it. No evasion. No hope. Sasuke's sword clashed with Naruto's chains of flame, but it was no use. His blade shattered under the immense pressure, and Naruto's flames roared in response, intensifying with every passing second. "You can't defeat me," Naruto spat, his voice filled with contempt. "You never could." With a wave of his hand, Naruto summoned the full fury of his flames. The inferno erupted, consuming everything in its path. Sasuke's body was thrown back, his form barely visible in the blaze. He tried to stand, his legs trembling, but the heat was unbearable. His body, once a vessel for the power of the Uchiha clan, was now nothing more than a puppet in the face of Naruto's overwhelming might. As Sasuke struggled to rise, Naruto descended upon him like a storm, his chains wrapping around Sasuke's body, immobilizing him. The flames that surrounded them twisted into a vortex, burning with a sadistic, almost playful hunger. "Goodbye, Sasuke," Naruto whispered, his voice full of venom and finality. "This world belongs to me now. You were nothing but a stepping stone. A distant memory." With a single motion, Naruto's flames engulfed Sasuke, reducing him to nothing more than ash. His body disintegrated in the flames, leaving only the faintest trace of his presence in the air. The rest of the rebellion watched in horror, their spirits crushed under the weight of their failure. Karen, desperate, tried to rush forward, but Naruto's flames met her with a terrifying force, pushing her back. She fell to the ground, gasping for air, unable to move against the torrent of power Naruto commanded. "You should all bow to me," Naruto declared, his voice cold and final. "You're all beneath me. This world is mine. You've lost." The survivors were forced to kneel, their bodies shaking, their hearts shattered. The world they had hoped to save was now irrevocably lost to the flames of the Phoenix King. Naruto stood victorious, his flames crackling in the silence that followed. The last rebellion had been snuffed out, and the world now belonged to him, completely and utterly. There were no more challengers. No more hope. He was the god of this world, and nothing, no one would ever take that away. The world had fallen into silence. No more battles raged in the villages. No more cries of resistance echoed through the forests or across the plains. The sound of battle, the clash of metal against metal, and the desperate pleas of those who had once fought for freedom were now mere memories. The only sound that remained was the crackling of fire, a constant presence in the wake of Naruto's domination. His flames had consumed it all, from the villages to the people, to the very earth itself. Naruto stood at the pinnacle of his empire, his back straight and his gaze piercing the horizon. Before him lay the ruins of what had once been a thriving world, a world of villages, of alliances, of hope. Now, there was only one ruler, one king. The immortal Phoenix King. His flames had taken everything. And in return, they had granted him eternity. But even with everything within his grasp, even with the entire world kneeling before him, Naruto couldn't help but feel an emptiness deep within his chest. He had achieved everything he had ever dreamed of, yet in the silence of his reign, a voice inside him whispered, "Is this truly enough?" The question lingered, unanswered, as he stared out over the land. The fires that raged across the world were both his greatest weapon and his prison. He had conquered everything, crushed every enemy, and destroyed every rival. There was no one left to challenge him, no one left to oppose his will. But the flames that burned so brightly around him also kept him isolated, surrounded by an impenetrable barrier of ash and destruction. Naruto had become a god, immortal, indestructible, and beyond reach. He could not be killed, could not be wounded, and could not be stopped. The power of his flames had transcended anything the world had ever known. But in the quiet moments between the roar of his power, he began to wonder if immortality was truly a blessing or a curse. He had never known the world without enemies. He had never known a time when he wasn't fighting, striving for something greater. Now that there was no one left to oppose him, what was the point? What was the purpose of ruling over a world that no longer had a spark of resistance? Naruto's gaze shifted downward, where the remnants of villages lay beneath his feet, their ruins still smoldering from the fires that had swept across them. He had burned them to the ground, just as he had burned every trace of weakness from his soul. But now, those same flames seemed to mock him, reminding him of what he had lost in his pursuit of power. He had sacrificed everything for this: his humanity, his relationships, his connections to others. He had torn down everything he once held dear, including the bonds that had once defined him. What remained now were only whispers of the people he had once known, their faces fading from his memory like the smoke of the fires he had set. Hinata's face appeared in his mind, a fleeting image of the woman who had once stood by his side. He had taken her as his consort, as a symbol of his power, but he had never truly loved her. He had used her, just as he had used everyone who had crossed his path. He had consumed everything, but in the process, he had consumed himself as well. Was this what he had truly wanted? To be alone at the top of the world, surrounded by nothing but the ashes of his enemies and the people who had once revered him? To be a god with no one left to challenge him, no one left to share his power with? The question gnawed at him, but he refused to answer it. He had no time for doubt. He had no time for weakness. He was the Phoenix King, and the world was his to command. Yet, as the days passed, the silence of his empire became unbearable. The flames that had once filled him with a sense of purpose now felt hollow, their warmth not comforting but suffocating. He had achieved his immortality, but in doing so, he had left behind everything that made him human. Naruto's eyes hardened as he turned away from the horizon, the weight of his thoughts pushing down on him. He had no choice but to move forward. The world had already bent to his will, and there was no turning back. His flames had forged an empire, and now he had to rule it. But as he stood atop his throne of burning stone, his mind wandered back to the world he had destroyed. The faces of those he had killed, those he had betrayed, and those he had abandoned. They all flashed before him, each one a reminder of the path he had chosen. He had become the very thing he had once hated, the tyrant who ruled with an iron fist, the god who demanded worship and obedience. The Phoenix King, who had burned the world to the ground. His thoughts turned to his former comrades, those who had once fought by his side. What had happened to them? They had all fallen, either in battle or to the weight of their own fear and doubt. He had burned their hopes and dreams along with the villages he had destroyed. In the end, they had all been swept away in the flames of his ambition. And now, there was nothing left. Naruto's gaze fell upon the throne before him, the seat of his power, the symbol of his unchallenged rule. It was a throne made of fire, its heat so intense that the air around it shimmered. He had built it with his own hands, with the flames that burned inside him, and now it was his to sit upon for eternity. But even as he sat there, his heart felt cold. The flames that surrounded him were no longer a source of strength. They were a cage, a prison of his own making. He had fought for this power, for this immortality, but now that he had it, he realized it was nothing more than a hollow victory. He had burned the world to ash, but in doing so, he had lost himself. The Phoenix King sat in silence, the weight of his own immortality pressing down on him. The flames that burned around him seemed to mock him, reminding him of the price he had paid for his power. He had conquered everything, but in the end, he had nothing left. As Naruto gazed into the flames, his heart heavy with the weight of his choices, he finally understood the true cost of immortality. And he knew, deep down, that it was a price he could never escape.